Welcome to Purrfect Takes. I'm your host, Stephen Patton, joined by my dear friend and co-host, Jake LaQuire. This week, we actually have our first video. So this is pretty exciting. For all those who listen on Apple or Spotify, it will still be the regular podcast recording you guys hear. Anybody looking for the video content, that will now be on YouTube.
Yep, super excited. We've done a pod before, like where we kind of FaceTimed or were talking to one of our guests. I believe it was when Tage came on. This is our first actual video podcast, so I'm excited. I'm trying to figure out where to look because like I'm here and here, you're here on my screen, but the camera's here, the notes are here. It's like it's hectic.
Yeah, it's a lot of stuff going on, a lot of stimulation. And this week's episode, we're going to be talking about and breaking down our top 10 quarterbacks going into 2024. The stipulation behind this exercise is that we're kind of looking at a 2-year window because it's typically like rosters in terms of the rotation and changing of new players, losing old players, et cetera, kind of meets that window. So we'll be considering cap, like their salary, what contract they're signed to, the age of the player, how well they produced up to this point, and how well we think they're going to project going into next year. So do we want to touch on anything around the NFL before getting into that?
I don't think there's anything huge. OTAs started for a bunch of teams, including our Panthers, started yesterday. And of course, the hype train is building, right? We have the picture of Bryce circulating today with his throwing arm and his arms looking a lot bigger. So that's good to see. You have JC Horn contributing. He had a nice pass breakup the other day during OTAs. So all the good things are happening. The hope is coming back. So that's a nice thing to see. But as we know, that doesn't necessarily equate to winning. So hopefully we turn it around this year with the new regime.
Yeah, no, JC Horn, the play I was actually thinking of is he was just running a little exercise and he high pointed a ball just in an individual drill and just grabbed it with one hand out of the air. And obviously a lot of guys do that in practice, but just seeing that kind of athleticism on display, like when he's on the field, he's one of the better players. It's just a matter of making sure he's on the field. So hopefully Dave Canales, Stan Morgan, they have a good system and plan in place to make sure that their star players are actually on the field and healthy when the season starts. So definitely off-season hype. We're going to be hearing this all off-season. We had it last year with the Panthers, drafting Bryce Young, having some of the players. Some crazy plays were made in practices. Even when we went, DJ Chark, I think, had a nice catch or two. So, yeah. And he didn't really do much in the regular season. So it's you got to almost pump the brakes on some of this. It's good to see it. But again, a lot of these guys aren't in pads. It's not full on contact, and that changes at the next level when you have guys running at full speed at each other. So without further ado, we'll jump into the quarterback rankings. And I think it's kind of obvious who's number one. If he's not your number one quarterback that you're building around as a franchise, then I question your quarterback evaluation. And for me, that's Patrick Mahomes. This guy just came off winning his second consecutive Super Bowl, his third in his career. He had MVP season 2 years ago when they won their second Super Bowl, and then he had his first MVP season back in 2018, his first year as a starter. So dude's torn it up every single year he's been in the league, despite even having, I would say, a poor wide receiving supporting cast over the past 2 years.
Yeah, you talked about him being a 2-time MVP. He could have been an MVP candidate every year, I think, since he's been a starter. He's been that consistent, just super high level to start the year. In the middle, there's usually a lull, but they finish strong every year. Good playoff runs every year. If you look at it, he's either ended the final play of his season every year has either ended in the AFC Championship with the other team or in the Super Bowl, which is just bizarre to think about. Obviously, they lose to the Patriots that first year, lost to the Bengals a few years back. But other than that, it's been winning the Super Bowl or losing in the Super Bowl. It's just complete dominance. And like you said, pretty poor or subpar receiving group this past year as far as wide receivers go. Obviously, Travis Kelce's been super strong during his time there. But even last year, he started to slow down a bit as well. So hopefully Xavier Worthy, the first-round rookie receiver that they took, will be able to contribute for them this season, maybe replace Tyreek Hill in some capacity when he left a couple years ago. But overall, Mahomes has to be the number one, right? Like you can, after Mahomes, you can start debating things, and you'll see we'll have a couple of debates here, but it's Mahomes. He's the best in the league right now, and he's making a really strong case for being the best ever.
Yeah, no, he's on that trajectory, and I think it's a matter of just him and Andy Reid continuing to grow and develop with each other, making sure that they're adding the right pieces on that offense now. And you get a couple more playmakers, whether that's Xavier Worthy stepping up as a rookie, being able to trade for maybe a veteran wide receiver in a year or two. I don't think the Bengals will necessarily trade T. Higgins to him. And I don't know if Brandon Ayuk would be on the table between the 49ers and Chiefs, but those are two wide receivers that if you were the target in a trade, that could definitely elevate that offense and put him in a stratosphere where he's putting up these insane numbers like he was back when he first started with Tyreek Hill and Travis Kelce. So that'd be cool to see. And then to your point about the playoffs, the only quarterback that Patrick Mahomes has lost to in regulation in the postseason is Tom Brady. Joe Burrow, even that first game against Tom Brady in the AFC Championship game at Arrowhead, all went to overtime. And this past Super Bowl goes to overtime. Like, this is just, it's something that it's really hard to do, or even just wrap your mind around that. This guy hasn't lost on the biggest stage. And it's very Michael Jordan-esque. For me, it's if he continues doing this, there's no question that he's that number one guy all time. But without further ado, after this kind of first echelon tier, we have two guys. You have quarterback 2 is my quarterback 3, and my quarterback 2 is your quarterback 3. And I want you to kind of explain why you have quarterback 2 where you do. I think it's completely fair given what he's done over the past couple years. But just love to hear your thoughts on it.
Yeah, so you alluded to it. We have 2 and 3 just flip-flopped. For me, I have Lamar Jackson as my QB2. Josh Allen QB3, I think, is pretty obvious.
Okay.
But for me, when I looked at both of these guys, and obviously past 5 years, they've both been really, really phenomenal in the regular season. But I think Lamar has taken, I don't want to say lesser, but overall, I think he's had less help during this little span, like a sample size, if you will, over the last 5 years. And I think what he's been able to do with that, 2 MVPs, taking Patrick Mahomes in the AFC Championship this year, obviously didn't play his best game in that game. I think we can all agree, but I don't think Todd Monken called a great game. I think it was just all over the place. But I think looking at what happened last year, what he's able to do with people who necessarily aren't as good as Stephon Diggs or don't have as strong or as deep of a defense year in and year out as the Bills have. Obviously, last year the Ravens defense was phenomenal under Mike McDonald, but I think what he's able to do just overall is just a little bit better. We see him do a little bit more, but Josh Allen is phenomenal as well. Like, aside from the 2 MVPs, I think the resumes looking at each other, it's hard to put Lamar Jackson in a tier above Josh Allen. That's why I have him in the same tier, really. But I think when it comes to accolades and stuff like that, when both of them have similar regular season and postseason success, you got to take that into account. So I went with the 2-time MVP at number 2. And it's interesting. Our number 1 guy, 2 MVPs. Number 2 guy, also 2 MVPs, for me at least.
Yeah. And I understand the accolades argument. When Lamar Jackson's been on the field and been healthy over the past half decade, the Baltimore Ravens, being that team, are one of the best teams in the NFL, and they have been. And the Bills, with Josh Allen, have also kind of entered that stratosphere. To me, it's going back and looking at Lamar Jackson's injury history and the fact that he's now in a air pass-heavy offense. And you wonder if, okay, Odell Beckham's leaving. Does Zay Flowers take a step in year 2? Does Rashad Bateman stay healthy? Does Tez Walker at a UNC, does he show flashes to where you have a field stretcher in that offense to pair with Mark Andrews in that run game that they have in Baltimore? And to me, it's just a lot of unknowns right now. And there are a lot of unknowns in Buffalo, especially with their wide receiving core. It's just we've seen Josh Allen take over and dominate games, and he's been on the field. He's been available. He's been healthy. And I think arguably he should have been a lot more prevalent in last year's MVP discussion, because this team went from probably not making the playoffs to getting the number 2 seed and really making a push and almost beating the Chiefs in Buffalo. And you could kind of say the same thing with the Baltimore Ravens. They had opportunities in that AFC Championship game. But again, that's why we talk about Mahomes being just in a different stratosphere than these two guys, despite how good they are. And to me, and this is the only point I want to make about Josh Allen before we kind of move on, is that I feel like if he can have a year like Mahomes had 2 years ago, where he leads one of, if not the best teams in the AFC with the wide receiving supporting cast he has right now, that's a game changer. to me, that's something where it's like people know that he only has Keon Coleman, Khalil Shakir. They just signed Chase Claypool, like those kind of guys, and he's making it work. I think that, again, just shows how special a player he is.
Yeah, for sure. Like I said, they're on the same tier to me, and it was really hard to separate them in any kind of way. It just came down to like you said, or like I said rather, the two MVPs for me, and like just having stuff written down on your resume throughout your time in the NFL, and that's what did it for me. But you brought up a good point where can Josh Allen do what Mahomes did a couple years ago with a kind of a paltry receiving cast this year? I think thinking like that is going to be the difference because we kind of need to see him to do that for him to be the undisputed number two guy for me. And that's just kind of why I have Lamar as number two, because during Lamar's MVP season, do you remember his receivers other than Hollywood Brown?
You had Hollywood, but you had Mark Andrews, and you had a dominant run game with Greg Roman. And that's just the difference between a Greg Roman offense and a Todd Monken. And both have played into Lamar's strengths. And Lamar's ability to avoid sacks and pressure is phenomenal, but he also makes a lot of bad plays. He had a very high negative play rate last year. I think it was one of the worst in the league last year. And that worries me. That worries me that if he can't clean that up and improve within the system, that he's creating more liabilities within that offense rather than like benefits. And that's worrisome.
That's fair to me. But even despite that, if you look at how they played against some of the better teams in the NFC last year in the regular season, the Lions, the what was it, the Seahawks? I'm leaving out one team. The only team that they didn't blow out was the Rams. They just dominated.
They beat the 49ers on Christmas. That was a dominant. Yeah.
Yeah. So like even despite those the tendency to produce negative plays, I think what he brings to an offense is special. Not to say that Allen isn't. It's just I think Lamar has a little bit more there.
It's like comparing like Mike Vick and Cam Newton. It's like, what kind of runner are you looking for? I think both have great arms. Both that have cannons for arms, which is crazy. And that's exactly like those two other quarterbacks that I think they have their games kind of modeled after in terms of like they're just prototype and build. After three, things shake up a little bit for you and me. It's not as clear cut that you have this guy here and I have him like a slot down below. At number 4, I have Justin Herbert, and I think with a run-heavy offense, it will allow him to drop back and just drop the bombs we've seen Herbert make over his entire career. I think he can operate very efficiently, but opening up some of those big play chunks, whether it is the Quentin Johnston or some of these other wide receivers they have on the roster. I think Ladd McConkey's an excellent addition. I think him and Herbert are going to have an excellent connection over the course of the next few years. And it's going to be interesting to see if they can actually make a push in the AFC. They still have a lot to do in terms of rebuilding that roster. But I'm a big fan of just how Jim Harbaugh has not only rebuilt the 49ers over the past decade, but also rebuilding Michigan to its kind of glory days and winning a championship there. It's just when you know how to win football games, you know how to put the right guys in the best position possible to succeed. And that's what I think is going to happen in Los Angeles over the next few years.
Yeah, I'm a big believer in I almost said Herbert, Jim Harbaugh as a head coach. If you look at his record as a starting head coach, it's something bizarre. He has like the 5th winning, like in terms of win percentage, it's like the 5th highest ever. He was just a winner in the pros when he was with the Niners. I think he kind of got unfairly ousted there, and you saw how long it took them to finally recover from that. They went through a couple of guys there. And then, like you said, brought Michigan to a national championship, first time since before 2000, which is, or I believe it was 2000, which is actually bizarre to think about because that's one of the, you think of a blue blood in football, you think Michigan. And now I like his fit here with the Chargers, but to me, this is a QB ranking, not a coach or infrastructure ranking. We're going to do those in the coming weeks. And so for me, Herbert's 5 for me, number 5. I love what he's been able to do to start his career, even starting from his rookie season where he just aired it out downfield, like play in and play out. Obviously, he's not looking at Keenan Allen and Mike Williams this year. He's going to have Quentin Johnston, who had a, we'll say, less than stellar rookie season, as somebody here, let me point to him, predicted he would have. Then he has Ladd McConkey, second-round receiver, who I think will work well underneath. So the weapons he has there are going to be interesting, I think. But for me, the number 4 guy, excuse me, that I have, who's always going to be compared to Herbert because they're in the same draft class, is Joe Burrow. They signed their extensions around the same time. They both have dealt with injuries throughout the regular season. Herbert's been banged up the last couple years, had to sit out the last 4 or 5 games last year. Herbert, obviously, ACL year 1. Year 2 came back strong. Year 3 was good. And then last year, I think it was his thumb, right, where he had to miss the last 8 or 9 games. So both have dealt with their fair share of injury. To me, it comes down to, has Joe Burrow, what has he done for his team versus Herbert? Obviously, they're both very good, but Burrow has brought them through the playoffs. He's brought them to that Super Bowl, brought them to the AFC Championship 2 years ago now, where, if we're being clear, they would have beaten Mahomes, I think, had there not been that late hit out of bounds on Joseph Asai, the edge rusher, which gave them the shorter distance to the game-winning field goal. So I like what he's done in the postseason. He does take a lot of sacks as well. We talked about that a little bit earlier with like Lamar and Josh Allen's avoidance. He actually takes a lot of sacks, and part of that's due to the poor O-line he's had around him. But he also makes the most of his opportunities. Electric connection with Jamar Chase and T. Higgins. And I just think that if you compare both of Burrow and Herbert, similar draft class, like I said, they have both dealt with a ton of injury. I just think Burrow's put in a little bit more in the regular season. We've seen those like monster 500-yard games from him. And he's brought his team a little bit further, actually a lot farther in the postseason, because the furthest Herbert has gotten was the first half against a guy we'll talk about here in a few minutes, and then it all kind of unraveled there. But for me, it's just kind of like how I had Lamar above Josh Allen, just a little bit more pedigree. That's what I look for with quarterbacks, because I think winning matters. That's something that I look at when we do like our draft breakdowns. I think being a winning quarterback matters, and for Burrow, he's been able to do that at this level. Herbert, we haven't seen it yet, but I think he's good enough to do that, and I like what's been put around him this offseason, and hopefully we see that from him going forward.
So what happens when you put Herbert on that Bengals offense? For me, Herbert has an ability to protect the ball a lot better, whether it's not taking sacks, not throwing interceptions. And I feel like he has the cannon and rifle to get the ball to those kind of playmakers, to where if he was in that situation, maybe we're talking about him winning the Super Bowl. Because remember, and I understand you're bringing up him losing to the Jaguars, and we'll talk about Trevor Lawrence in a little bit, but he didn't have those playmakers. He had Keenan Allen, he had Mike Williams, he had a defense that honestly has sucked over the past couple of years, that you hope Jim Harbaugh can kind of fix and bring some like aggression and like true just like heat, because you haven't seen that with Staley's defenses. So I know that's a tangent, but that to me is like the one thing that if Herbert was in that place, we see a completely different result.
No, and I like that you bring that up, because when you look at the two guys, they're like their traits, right? Herbert definitely has the stronger arm. I think while Burrow is like a sneaky mobile guy, he's like Rodgers to me. He knows how to scramble and get out of stuff like that. I think Herbert's more built to run a little bit more because he's bigger. The thing that Burrow has that he doesn't is that aggression that you talk about with Jim Harbaugh. What we see from Herbert the past 2 or 3 years, and I know you're a Joe Lombardi guy, but I think he kind of instilled this into Herbert, was he doesn't take the chance on third down to like rifle it downfield into the tight windows like we saw him do his rookie year. Even though in Oregon he didn't have the supporting cast around him, I don't think he was afraid to do things like that. But I think his early play, the first 2 or 3 years in that system has taken away his willingness, I think, to make those throws, to attempt those throws. That's kind of something we look at with Josh Allen, right? Josh Allen, yeah, he has some of these bizarre, dumb turnovers, right? But on some of those plays, he'll fit a ball down, like through a seam 40 yards downfield. It'll be a highlight perfect catch by Stephon Diggs or whomever's out there, Keon Coleman, Curtis Samuel now. That's the difference with me. Like, even though Burrow, I don't think, has the 70-yard arm that Herbert might have, he has the willingness to take those chances. And maybe it's because he trusts Jamar Chase and T. Higgins more than Herbert did Mike Williams or Keenan Allen early in his career. But he has that ability in him. And I think we saw that in those postseason runs. If you look at that Raiders playoff game, or I believe it was the Raiders, they had, or maybe it was the Titans, that first playoff game that the Bengals had that year where they made it to the Super Bowl. He was getting blasted. I think he got sacked 9 times that game, but he was still fitting the ball downfield into tight windows. And I think that's the difference you see in terms of mentality or aggression between the two. I think Herbert has all the tools necessary, but he just needs to bring more of that to the table, because if he doesn't, I think the weapons he has now aren't going to be good enough to make up for that. Whereas if you had Keenan Allen still underneath or Mike Williams down the sideline, I think they would, but I think he needs to bring that aggression a little bit more now.
So the only game I'm going to bring up, and we'll start moving on to other quarterbacks, is I think it was week 2, 2 years ago, and it was when he cracked his ribs against Kansas City. But like throughout the duration of that game, even after he kind of cracks some of his ribs, he's rifling like passes in the windows that are just absolutely insane, and he's willing to do that. I think the biggest issue is he understood from a schematic standpoint that taking sacks and taking losses and getting into third and long situations was not beneficial. And sometimes it's just better to get the ball out quick and survive to the next play. And I think having that mentality is part of the reason. Now, Patrick Mahomes, his sack avoidance is partially because he knows how to move behind the pocket, give himself some more time. But like a guy like Tom Brady, for instance, or Dan Marino in the past, these guys that are able to avoid hits are going to help themselves in the future so much more than guys that are taking hits like Joe Burrow. Because Joe Burrow right now with his hit rate, that arc and that cycle, he could be on a Carson Wentz trajectory where he could have a couple more injuries. His arm could get wonky a little bit. He could lose some of these wide receivers. And we aren't talking about him in the same air and echelon that we have been just because he had a really good team around him for these first couple years. So that's the biggest hesitation on that. If you have anything else to say before we get into, because like you said, Justin Herbert's your number 5, but kind of move on into the next.
And the last thing I will say is I agree with you there that living to see the next play is like generally a good idea, right? It keeps you healthy. It keeps drives moving, or rather like mitigates negative plays because like on third downs, if you throw it away, which Herbert has been known to do over the past couple of years, that kills the drive. But when the games start to matter, like we say the playoff games and stuff like that, that's when you can't be doing that, when you need to make the play, when you need to get it downfield. And we were able to see that from Burrow during his run that first or second year rather that he was starting to the Super Bowl. I think we were able to see that just a bit more, and just seeing that it gives me like the inclination, oh, he can keep doing that as they move forward, like on a new team now that he's got paid and stuff like that. But if Herbert's able to do that, he has the physical profile to be like guy number 2 or 3 on this list if he has his potential. But like you said, Herbert's my number 5 there. They're in a similar tier for me, like Lamar and Allen were for you. You have a different number 5. He's a lot lower on my, he is on my list, but he's a lot lower on the list. And that's our first NFC guy, if I'm reading it right.
Yes, it's the first NFC guy on either list. And to your point about Joe Burrow, I'm a little bit lower on Joe Burrow. He is on my top 10 list. But the guy that I have right now at 5 is Dak Prescott. He had one of his best seasons of his entire career last year. And a lot of people were a little bit skeptical. You have Kellen Moore leaving to Los Angeles. You have Ezekiel Elliott gone. You're relying more on Tony Pollard and CeeDee Lamb. And you're hoping that Jake Ferguson can take a step with Dalton Schultz and Noah Brown leaving in free agency. They did trade for Brandon Cooks, so I'll give you that. But this is a guy that dropped 4,500 yards, 36 touchdowns, and the last time that we saw him throw 30 or more touchdowns was back in 2021. He threw less than 10 interceptions, very efficient. This is a guy that was able to have timing and rhythm down with all of his wide receivers, not just CeeDee Lamb. And it just goes to show that they had a lot of good structure. They started using motion as the year went on. And the command that Dak has at the offensive line is insane. Like it's close to kind of like a Peyton Manning level, and it's what gives him an edge in the NFL. And I think some of that pre-snap game is what has him so high on this list for me, because I think he does a lot of things well or just adequate, but that I think is truly elite.
Yeah, I like the point you made there. Obviously, phenomenal year last year. We could have talked about him, or we did talk about him probably weeks, I don't know, 8 through 12, 8 through 14, like being at the head of that MVP discussion there, right up there with some other QB, like Purdy was up there too. It was a really weird MVP, or should have been McCaffrey's. But my thing with him, and you said to be holistic when we made this list, bringing like cap into account, age, all that kind of stuff. He's the oldest guy on, I think actually you have one more older guy on the list. He's the oldest guy on my list, or like, yeah, on my list. I think he's turning 31 this year. Bring up cap constraints and stuff like that. He's an unrestricted free agent this upcoming off season. No tag, no trade clause. So he's going to be either resetting or getting really top of the line money there. So those are kind of two negatives per se against him. But I really think he's been let's say the benefit of having a strong supporting cast I would say his tenure with the Cowboys. We looked at his Rookie of the Year season. This was way before we were podcasting or anything like that. You and I both said that Rookie of the Year award should have been Ezekiel Elliott's, right? I think he had
Yeah.
1,600 yards or something that year, something crazy. I think, me personally, I think he inherited the best offensive line ever in NFL history. That first little stretch he had, Tyron Smith, Travis Frederick, Zach Martin, the whole line there was excellent. He's had a strong run game his entire tenure there. CeeDee Lamb's really good, but I don't want to take away from him at all. He was phenomenal last year. But to my point, this is a what QB would you want to build around the next 2 years list. And for me, all these guys that we've already talked about or that we will talk about have already are on their rookie extensions, like their first big deal, because they deserved it, right? We have like Mahomes,
Absolutely.
Lamar, Josh Allen, Joe Burrow, Herbert. All of them deserved it, or they're on those rookie deals about to get paid or will get paid in the near future. Except for one who's kind of a weird case, but he was like a late bloomer, so to speak. So his extension stuff's kind of weird. But for me, I would almost always rather have the young guy who's played at a similar level and has that potential over the guy who's aging a little bit, because as we see in the NFL now, with guys like Brady and Rodgers aside, the careers aren't that long, especially
Yeah.
if you're going to be getting hit a lot, which he doesn't. He's very good at avoiding hits and stuff like that. But to me, I'm betting on the potential of some of these other guys here over what we see now from Dak Prescott. I think he's kind of tapped out where he is my point.
Yeah. And like if we're talking about like a Kirk Cousins who's already like in his mid 30s, I
Right.
completely understand that. But we're talking about a guy that's entering his early 30s. I feel like he's like from a physical standpoint just exiting his prime, but I think the mental game is getting a lot better with him.
Mhm.
And so some of these younger guys, that's where he has the advantage is he knows how to manipulate defenses maybe in a way that these other quarterbacks don't. And that's what sets you apart. I think that's what puts him in my top 5 here is I think he's still going to show what we saw last year. I think he's going to work his way into the MVP conversation. Do I think he's going to get it? Absolutely not. But I do think he's going to be kind of talked about because, again, this is a good Cowboys football team, and he's still in the same structure. Where a guy like Kirk Cousins, he's in a completely different offense. He's coming off a major injury. It's stuff like that where I think when you factor in some of those like age or cap constraints, it's not as big of a concern for me with Dak. But I understand kind of where that worry is.
Yeah. Real quick, let me ask you a question regarding Dak, because he is an upcoming free agent and our exercise is the next 2 years. If he does hit free agency and goes somewhere else, do you think he needs to have similar infrastructure to be as good as he is? Because for me, it's hard to see as strong of a supporting cast as the Cowboys the past couple years. Like, let's say who's going to be a need, like the Raiders. Let's say the Raiders dish out a ton of money for him in free agency.
So I would pump the brakes on that. We've seen these Shanahan coaches throughout the league. And what I mean by Shanahan, Mike Shanahan. So the guys that were on that Washington team back in the early 2010s, but mainly that 2012, 2013, 2014 year. And we saw Sean McVay kind of operate with a game manager in Jared Goff, and he went out and he got Matthew Stafford. I think it would be in Mike McDaniel's interest. And I understand you have two on this top 10 list, so I don't want to take that away from you. This is a differing of opinions. But I think if Mike McDaniel went out and said, hey, let's go trade for him or let's go sign him, I think I'd have to look at their cap situation, but I think they could structure it where it's lower cap hits early on in those first couple of years. They have some veterans that are coming off the books. You can pay a guy like that, and I think that would give your offense a different dimension because now you have somebody that can do a standard, typical like drop back and operate a normal offense rather than having to do all these funky motions and play actions and bootlegs to get guys out in space and give your quarterback time. So that is where I would see a potential landing spot in terms of like what would be his best trajectory. Now, a team like the Raiders, they still have Devontae Adams, they have Jacoby Myers, they have a 2 tight end set like we talked about with 12 personnel. That could be fun, but I think the Dolphins would be the better spot.
My only retort to that would be, can you drop back with that O-line? Like, can you?
But maybe they're able to draft guys. Maybe they sign a couple guys. Maybe they're able to fix that offensive line similar to what the Rams have prioritized. But yeah, as of right now, I don't know if I trust Dak behind that offensive any quarterback behind that offensive line. So
Gotcha. So like for me, it was obviously Mahomes. Then in another tier was Jackson Allen. Then it was Burrow, Herbert. And then the next kind of group of guys were all meshed together. I have Dak in there, like you talked about, I have Tua in there. But for me, number 6, the top of that tier is Trevor Lawrence. Obviously, uh, not as good a year that we wanted this past year, based on that playoff win and coming off the high of the season prior. He started off the season pretty well, I thought, and then the whole team really just kind of sunk in the last half of the year. But I think his physical profile, I think his improvement from year 1 to year 2, even to year 3 of like diagnosing and seeing things pre-snap, I still believe a lot in him. And I think he has the highest potential out of all the other guys I have listed here to be the next kind of guy, like the next Burrow Herbert level guy. They're talking, or there have been reports of them talking about an extension this offseason for him that's going to be up there in the $50 million range. I said before on this pod, I think he deserves it. And to me, I don't know. I've been a strong Doug Peterson start calling plays again so we can see the best of Trevor Lawrence. And hopefully they do that this year. They've tried to address wide receiver, bringing in guys like Gabe Davis. They drafted Brian Thomas Jr., who we're both a fan of. And so to me, it's going to come down to, can the O-line hold up and can he continue to grow and take the next step, which is, I guess, being more consistent at that high level. But I really think he can be one of the stars in this league, and hopefully we'll be able to see it soon.
So if we account, and Trevor Lawrence is at 7 for me, so he's right after this. I agree with a lot of the things you say. I think he gets a lot more flack than he should, especially when you turn on the tape and you see some of the throws he's making. Like, he's just able to put this ball on the other side of the field, or he understands what the defense is doing, and he's able to get in the correct play and make the right read. We talk about the Dolphins' offensive line. The Jaguars' offensive line was probably just as worse, if not as bad. And we saw that with their time to throw. Tua had the fastest time to throw. Trevor Lawrence, I think, had the second or third, depending on how many dropbacks you're looking back for quarterbacks. And, like, that's insane. It just goes to show you the quarterback awareness of going, okay, I know my offensive line can't hold up. We're just going to have to get the ball out quick. But when you adjust for receiver drops, dropped interceptions, luck on interceptable passes, fumble recoveries, interception returns, giving credit for expected yards after catch, Trevor Lawrence last year was 6th in adjusted EPA per play. And EPA per play is usually a pretty good indicator of kind of the top quarterbacks, or at least top quarterback performers. And to me, that's a huge, huge benefit to him, especially like when you said they add Brian Thomas. You have Christian Kirk coming off the injury. You still have Evan Ingram. They don't have Zay Jones there anymore, but they have a field stretcher in Gabe Davis. And while he definitely has an issue with drops, it's not like Trevor Lawrence is not used to that already.
Yeah, it can't be worse than this past year. There's like a compilation out there. It's like Ridley dropped like 6 or 7 touchdowns. So we saw that. They started the year 8-3. We could be talking about them a lot differently. Maybe they win the division or something. But yeah, I'm a big fan of him. And to your point, you said he was 6th in adjusted EPA, right? 6th on my list as the QBs going forward. So that worked out perfectly for me. But I'm a big believer in him. And you obviously are too, because he's the next guy for you. But you have a bit of a different direction at pick number 6.
So we talk about the 31-year-old Dak Prescott. I'm going 5 years older at 36 years old, a former first overall pick for the Detroit Lions, and Matthew Stafford. I think he's rejuvenated his career with Sean McVay. I think they have a great offensive line in Los Angeles. I think he has wide receivers to throw to. And when you turn on the tape, just like I was talking about with Trevor Lawrence, you see him make darts and throws that, like, maybe 5 quarterbacks can make in the NFL. And I'm being serious. Like, we're talking the Patrick Mahomes, the Josh Allens, the Herberts, the guys that can really just rifle it in and make some of these just like highlight reel like throws of like, how did he do that? And you still see Stafford doing that. And he's always been known throughout his career to have a cannon. That doesn't look like it's slowing down. He's a year removed from that big injury he had a couple years ago. And for me, I think he's still building confidence. I think they have a chip on their shoulder after losing the wild card in Detroit, and feel like they have like a statement to make. And so I think Sean McVay, they're here for it. They're ready for it. And I think he's going to produce over the next couple of years. Now, after 2 years, like if this was like a 5-year window, I think he's definitely going to fall off a little bit, just like we've seen a lot of these other quarterbacks, that when you approach that 40-year range, your body just doesn't hold up anymore.
Yeah, and you mentioned it, the I think it was his elbow injury a couple years ago.
Yep.
Like stuff like that gives me pause, especially with older QBs like this. But I think you make a good point. Stafford has one of the all-time arms in our league. Still super strong arm, and with the addition of Puka Nakua, with Cooper Cup hopefully being healthy this year, I think that offense can make some noise. It just comes down to age for me, right? Even though this isn't a 2 year exercise, I think going forward or quarterbacks I want to build around, I think I'm always going to pick the young and upcoming QB over the older guy. He would be in like my honorable mention list at the bottom, but certainly he still has the talent. We saw that last year. And as a Puka Nakua shareholder, hopefully he still has the talent. But as a Panthers fan, hopefully the Rams kind of tank it this year because we do have their second round pick, I believe. But other than that, like I've conflicted feelings, right? I want him to do well, but as a Panthers fan, no. But he's still really, really good quarterback. And then at number 7, unless you have anything else with Stafford,
No,
Trevor
I
Lawrence for
had
you.
Trevor Lawrence. So who was your guy at number 7?
For me, and this was the hardest person to place on the list for me because he's only been in the league 1 year. But that 1 year we saw last year was really, really strong from him. CJ Stroud, phenomenal rookie season, rookie of the year winner. I think it was up there between him and Puka. Obviously, the QB is going to win it, but I think he deserved it. Led them to a playoff win. It seems like Texans fans have already forgotten about the spell where Deshaun Watson was good for them, was like probably their best quarterback in their franchise's history, that little stretch there. I think Stroud has already erased all that. He's proven that he's the guy to build around him and Will Anderson, who they drafted a pick later. But just a really phenomenal rookie season. Only 5 interceptions. And he didn't have a pick until it was like week 9 or 10. Like, took care of the ball really well. I am a big fan of their system there and their players, especially now that they added Stephon Diggs. When we talk about skill position next week, they're going to be up there, maybe number 1 or 2. But I just really like what he did as a rookie. It's hard to find any blemishes on him. Had a really big games and was composed most of the time. The only thing for me, I guess, is that when you turn on the tape, a lot of his throws are like really easy to make. Not a lot of contested catches or anything like that. But for a rookie that's operating the system, you can't ask for much more than that. He operated at a high level, and if he continues to progress and those windows get tighter, maybe he'll make the tight window throws and continue to be one of the top QBs in our game. For me, it's just hard to put him over like all the established guys that we talked about up to this point.
So I have CJ Stroud, just like we had with the Trevor Lawrence kind of debacle, just like a step below. So he's not 7 for me. He is at 8. And what I love about him is kind of what you're saying, is that he's able to make the throws. And we saw it at Ohio State. We talked about it even last year going into the draft process. We thought Bryce Young was the best overall quarterback. We thought CJ Stroud was the most accurate quarterback.
Mm-hmm.
He was able to place the ball really, really well at Ohio State. It was just he was surrounded by like Pro Bowl wide receivers in college. And so when you think about that, it was like, okay, well, if we remove the supporting cast, is he still going to be able to operate this way? And we saw Bobby Sloat go, okay, we just need to give you time. So all these 6-7 man protections, they go out, they trade for Stephon Diggs. They add him to their wide receiver room as Tank Dell is coming back from injury. And to me, they really are positioning themselves to try to make that push to be a Super Bowl contender, similar to how the Bengals were with Joe Burrow in year 2. So I think they're just trying to maximize that rookie contract. They know what they have in him. And I love CJ Stroud from a standpoint of he is a big quarterback, that prototypical guy that you want to see at 6'2", 6'3", and he really has a big arm. So when you have those two attributes, he takes care of the ball. He's able to be accurate on these deeper downfield throws. It's going to give you opportunities to win games that other quarterbacks aren't going to give you.
Yeah, for sure. I think the trajectory is only up for them. I think they will be up there with like the Chiefs, the Ravens, I don't want to say the Bills. I think the Bills will take a step back, but like those kind of teams that expect to compete for deep postseason runs, I think they're gearing up for that. And you said he was your number 8. He was my number 7. At number 8, and you alluded to this a bit earlier, I have Tua on the list, and I think he rightfully gets clowned for not having the strongest arm or anything like that. He's also dealt with some injury history, kind of like guys like Burrow and Herbert have. I just think his were probably a bit more graphic and severe, given they were like brain injuries and hip injuries and stuff like that. But I think something that's really underrated with QBs, and Tua is a master at this, is operating the system that they are in. You asked a good question earlier. If you put Herbert on the Bengals, what would he do? Like, would he be able to produce and stuff like that? And I talked about him not having the aggression or something like that. I think if you put a lot of people in a quick trigger timing offense like that, that they wouldn't be able to operate it as effectively. Because even going back to college at Alabama before his hip injury there, he was one of the best QBs in the league at hitting the quarterback, or excuse me, hitting the receiver like a minute, or not a minute, a second after the snap. He's really quick, decisive. He knows where to put the ball. And even though he doesn't have the strongest arm, he's able to get the ball in space to the playmaker for them to go make a play. It's kind of like what Bryce Young's one of his strongest strengths was coming out of college, is giving the guys opportunities to go make plays and create yak and stuff like that. Tua was one of the best in that in the entire league. And I know he doesn't have the Josh Allen arm or anything like that, but I really think that if you drop other QBs in the system, they won't be able to operate, because look at the O line. He has to be able to do stuff like that. Otherwise, the play isn't going to happen. Despite all the speed on the offense, they can't operate it if they don't have a quarterback that's not mentally as fast as the players are physically.
Yeah. And another thing that I want to talk about, and I brought this up with several quarterbacks on this list, and he's not in my top 10, but one thing he does extremely well is avoid sacks.
Mm-hmm.
And he's obviously had some bad hits with the concussions, the hip surgeries, you name it. Some of those injuries have definitely been rough. But overall, he takes a lot less hits. He goes down a lot less frequently than a guy like Joe Burrow. And that paired with the fact that, like what you're talking about, he has a very quick release. He can get the ball to his playmakers and they can do their job. Tyreek Hill came out saying after he got traded to the Dolphins that he thought Tua was a more accurate passer than Mahomes. I'm not going to get into that argument. I'm not going to
He's got to
side
hype
with
this guy up, right?
I get it. I get it. You get traded to him, and there was even instances. I think they were playing the Washington Commanders this past year, and Tyreek Hill ran kind of a post route, and the way he ran it, Tua kind of put the ball behind him. But in the post press conference of the game, like Tyreek Hill said, no, Tua put the ball where it was supposed to be. I kind of ran the wrong route and then had to adjust from there. And that just goes to show that Tua, yes, with his timing and practices, is putting the ball exactly where it should be for the most part. The biggest thing comes back to the fact that he doesn't have the biggest arm and can't necessarily make these great needle-like throws 15, 20, 25 plus yards down the field. And I think that's what separates him kind of from the echelon, the top tier guys. And that's exactly how you have it here. So I think if we want to talk about putting Tua in a range, I think 7 to 15 is perfect in today's NFL.
Yeah, and like I said, after I guess Trevor Lawrence, it was hard for me to place the rest of them, and I think I have him here ahead of the next two guys. One of them being Dak, just because the age and the cap implications. I don't think Tua's going to get as big a contract as Dak Prescott will in free agency this upcoming year. Spoiler, I guess, Dak's my number 9. We talked about him with you. He was number 5 for you. I like everything he's done, especially in recent years. I think he's taken a lot of big steps early in his careers. I think he wasn't necessarily like a turnover machine, but he would make a lot of bad plays on critical junctures. I think I can think of a lot of really deep third down sacks. One specific one against the Eagles always comes to mind with me, but I think he's really cleaned that up. Going forward, I think the Cowboys should retain him. I think they're whatever Jerry Jones is doing posturing is just really dumb in my opinion, because they have to pay him Micah Parsons and CeeDee Lamb eventually. Don't know why they're waiting on anything, but they'd be foolish not to bring him back. And like you said, a team like the Dolphins, if they think he can operate that quick like Tua is able to, I think his arm is quite an upgrade over Tua's, and his ability to – Dak's not a big runner, but I think he's able to move when he needs to with the ball. I think that'd be a good upgrade there if they are inclined to make that happen. But I really think the Cowboys need to retain him, especially if they want to keep the regular season success going forward, because we talked about this, I think last week or a couple weeks ago. They've been 12-5 in the regular season the past 3 seasons. That's nothing to scoff at. I think that's the most regular season wins in the NFC during that time span. So it's just playoff gaffes, and I don't want to put that all on Dak, because you have things like this past year, and we'll talk about the QB that they faced in a second here, but that was just a shit show, excuse my language, from the jump. Like, Dak did not play well, but neither did anybody else. The coaches I guess they weren't prepared. It was just bad. And I think if they want to clean all that up, they just can't get rid of him, because who's going to be better than him right now for them going forward?
I think the biggest thing goes back to the fact that they aren't happy with this.
Right,
And
right.
if
And
they go 12 and
yeah,
5 and they plateau, then it's like, okay, Dak's not worth us paying all this money. Let's go draft a rookie who will probably be half as great as Dak is from a performance standpoint. But from a contract standpoint, that's going to save you millions and millions of
mhm.
dollars to where you can still extend CeeDee Lamb, Micah Parsons, and then maybe potentially sign a couple other guys to where you're putting stars and playmakers around a younger quarterback, a cheaper quarterback. And I think that is the direction with a new head coach that the Cowboys will take if they meet the same result that they have over the past few years.
Yeah, and I'm with you, and we talked about that. I think in our draft precursors, where the if the expectation for the Cowboys is to be as good as they are, then I think Dak is the way to go. But I talked about last year, I thought that they should reset because I think that they had plateaued, and obviously we saw it happen in the playoffs. They got blown out by a team that had no business being there. I don't think any of us thought at the start of the season had business. Well, no, I don't want to say that. Had business blowing out the Cowboys in
Okay,
AT&T
blowing
Stadium in
out.
the
That's
playoffs.
fair.
In
Yes, that's
AT&T
fair.
Stadium, not like they didn't go up to Lambeau. That was in their dome, the nice stadium. They got crushed. And I guess this is a good segue because your number 9 guy, my number 10 guy, was the guy who orchestrated that just shellacking, and that's Jordan Love.
And he's getting better.
Hmm.
And that's the crazy part. He said some of the plays that he left on the field earlier in the year, he wasn't leaving those on the field against a team like Dallas. He was now granted, I think it was some of the touchdowns he threw that game, the most separation that we
Yeah.
saw like a tight end wide receiver have for a touchdown or a scoring play like all year. And it just goes to show that what they saw in film with Matt LaFleur and that coaching staff, and then what they did with their play design. I saw at one point it was supposed to be like in breaking or post route from one of the wide receivers. I think it might have been Dontavian Wicks. Might have even been like Christian Watson. I forget who was making the in breaking route, but they came back to the outside, and Gilmore, who was on him, a veteran cornerback who understands the play design, play structure, that kind of broke play rules. Like you don't typically have that setup, but because they knew where the defense was going to trend, he was wide open and it was an easy completion. And it's some of those things that Jordan Love understanding where he needs to go with the ball, being in a system that is going to get him wide open wide receivers, and he's able to minimize the mistakes he's had on the field. So he takes very few sacks. He's good at the sacks he does take. They don't cost his team a lot. And when you're able to hit on some of these bigger plays and not cost your team on the back end, I think it puts you an echelon above game manager. And that's why I have him here in the top 10. He's a guy that I think will take a step this next year and be one of the top quarterbacks in the NFC. I know guys want to put guys like Jalen Hurts and Brock Purdy on this list. I think he's better than them, and I think he's going to prove that this year.
Yeah, I certainly think he's better than Purdy as well. The thing I like about Jordan Love, and we talked about this before the season, it was like if he can be average, the Packers are going to be fine, right? I think we were talking about this before the show. He was a little bit better than average, and look what they did. They made the playoffs, won a playoff game. Could have won 2 playoff games if we're talking about the Niners, but obviously they fell short there. But the thing I like most about him is that all those weapons he has were first and second year players, and he's
Yep.
going into his second year as a starter. So he's going to mesh with all these young players that are both they're ascending, he's ascending. I think the sky's the limit with this offense, and I think you're right. He has the capacity to be one of, if not the best quarterback in the NFC this upcoming season. Because if you look at our lists, we only have 2 other NFC guys. I only have one, and it's Dak. And to me, Dak is kind of at his peak. One of the reasons I have a lot of other people above him is because I think they can deal with some ascendance in the next couple years. I think Dak's kind of capped out physically, like you said, but Jordan Love still pretty young, even though it's his. We think about it being his second year as a starter, but this will be his 5th year in the league. And like I talked about with the contract stuff with Lawrence and I believe Tua, Jordan Love's contract is kind of iffy. He signed like a 2-year extension, I believe, wasn't it prior to the season?
He's
Um,
making
like
13.5 million. Yeah, it was a weird adjustment he
they like
made last
forego
year.
the 5th year option, right, in lieu of an
Yes.
extension, something like that. But I mean, he had never been a starter before, so I guess the security was better. But he's going to be getting a bigger payday, bigger extension coming up soon if he keeps playing like this for sure.
Yeah, and like what you talked about, that young nucleus is going to give them the flexibility to extend a player like that and not lose a lot of talent right away. And that's where it's like when you talk about the Packers as a whole, this is a team that really is on the up and up in the NFC. When we talk about teams that are going to supplant the Dallas Cowboys that we just talked about, the San Francisco 49ers, the Philadelphia Eagles, if they kind of go through a down spurt. Like, this is one of those teams that are going to rise to the top and be one of the contenders for the next few years. So I think he's at the forefront of that. He is going to be talked about as a top 10 quarterback. I don't think it's going to be this year, but in the next couple of years, especially if he starts gelling and making better plays and able to create more opportunities for this offense, I think, like you said, sky's the limit, and he could really be in the MVP conversation and really be talked about as one of maybe the top 5 quarterbacks in the NFL. So we'll see if that's the case. He's your quarterback number 10. My quarterback number 10 is Joe Burrow. It goes back to the fact of where we're talking about contracts just a little bit ago with Jordan Love. If we look at inflated APY, like the value that Joe Burrow is being paid when he was paid last offseason, he is the highest paid quarterback in the NFL. His inflated APY would be a little under $63 million. His current APY is $55 million, which was higher than what Justin Herbert got, higher than what Lamar Jackson got. And I would argue both of those guys are better quarterbacks. And so he's getting paid more than those guys. He has an injury history. And my worry is that once T. Higgins leaves, is Jamar Chase and Jermaine Burton going to be enough in this offense? I think Jermaine Burton's going to be good, but it's one of those things that if they don't start hitting on these draft picks to kind of replenish that offense, I'm a little worried about the production and if there will be kind of like a downfall and a downslide, especially with how good the AFC is. A lot of the quarterbacks that are on this list are from the AFC. This is a stacked conference, and if he doesn't kind of show out, then it almost looks like a bad investment from the Bengals standpoint.
I'm with you there. Good thing, and we were talking about this a couple of days ago. The Bengals are one of the best at drafting ahead. So we talk about losing T. Higgins, talk about maybe the tackles not being as strong. They draft Mims, they draft Burton, drafted 2 receivers last year. So I think they're going to be able to fill in the gaps. And then if you talk about the contract stuff, I also don't think he's better than Lamar Jackson. We could argue Herbert if you wanted. But that's just the way the business works, right? When you're up next, if you're worth the big extension, you're going to get paid the most, right? And he's just a product of being paid after. I think he was paid after Herbert, right? It was like 5 days after his extension.
He was paid after, and then I think Lamar was paid after that because the whole debacle about whether he was going to get traded or all that, and then him getting signed and then not getting a fully guaranteed deal, even though requested. Yeah, it was after all that, and that was, I think, the timeline of it last offseason.
He was just the next guy up, right? It wouldn't surprise me if Trevor Lawrence's AAV, APY, like yearly thing, if he takes a step this year, like if they don't extend this offseason, if he plays well this year, wouldn't surprise me if he's whatever the next one is, like 57 or something like that. I don't know the exact number, but like it's just it's the nature of being next up, right?
I think the other thing to look at when we have these conversations, it's not always next up as so much as, okay, let's look at like guaranteed money. So if we look at just straight guaranteed money, Deshaun Watson is the highest right now all time in NFL history, and that just goes to show you like maybe you shouldn't bank on a guy that wasn't playing on your team prior. If this was a homegrown guy that you're extending on the same coaching staff, fine, whatever. But when you're trading for a guy that's been off the field for a year or so, we saw that kind of blow up in their face. Joe Burrow is second on that list with almost $220 million guaranteed at signing. The next guy after that, Justin Herbert at 193, and then after that, Lamar Jackson at 185. So even though we talk about it being like a staggered progression, Joe Burrow got the most guaranteed money by a wide distance. And I think that's what's more alarming because Trevor Lawrence, like you said, he could sign a deal in the same APY. He could get over $60 million in APY. We talked about that a couple weeks ago on this show. But his guaranteed money is probably going to be closer to a guy like Herbert's who hasn't had as much playoff success or these regular season accolades as a guy like Joe Burrow and Lamar Jackson. And so I think that's going to be the difference when we see those signed is that, yes, the APY might be there, but the inflated money is kind of alarming for me in terms of Burrow's contract.
Yeah, I think that's a fair argument. And then just like some honorable mention guys, or I kind of wrote these guys are hard to rank for me. Number one, I had Rodgers. I think he played pretty well prior to that last season in Green Bay and prior to being traded to the Jets, but he played like 4 plays for the Jets. So we don't really know what's happening there. I believe he's 41 this season. So he's up there in age too, like we talked about with Stafford, and you alluded to Kirk Cousins as well. I don't know what it's going to be like, but they do have like decent receivers that on paper, their O-line should be strong, but they also play on that MetLife turf. So don't know about that one. Jalen Hurts, I think he's improved steadily. I just don't think he's taken the leaps that a lot of these other guys have. Like consistently. Obviously, the year that they went to the Super Bowl, he played out of his mind, but I think he hasn't lived up to that level this past season. And then for me, Kyler
That's the
Murray.
tush push. Like
Yeah,
they live off the tush push. Like
yeah.
that's the thing.
I didn't want to say it. I didn't want to say it. All right. But yeah, if they outlawed the tush push, how many total touchdowns would he have last year, or even the year before that? Would be a good question. And
he
then
doesn't break Cam's record. Josh Allen does.
Josh Allen does. Yeah,
Hurts is not breaking Cam's record if the tush push is illegal.
I'm with you there. And then the last one I have is Kyler. I'm a big Kyler Murray fan. I think he's really underrated. I think what Cliff Kingsbury did in his time at Arizona kind of stunted, no pun intended, stunted Kyler's growth as a quarterback, kind of destroyed what an NFL quarterback should be doing. The air raid just doesn't work in the NFL, all right? Like, it's a respect to Mike Leach, RIP. It is a gimmick offense at the college level that works because you can out-athlete the college DBs and because defense in college is kind of iffy. In the NFL, you just can't do that because you're in a division with guys like Jalen Ramsey or guys like the aging era of the Legion of Boom when he first started there. Like, they're going to beat these receivers. So I think that was a huge hindrance to him. Hopefully now with, I believe it's Drew Petzing is the offensive coordinator, right? Hopefully second year with him. Kyler looked pretty decent coming off of his injury last year, and they add one of the best receiver prospects ever. Hopefully that offense takes a step and Kyler's able to show us what made him so good to be drafted first overall that year.
Yeah, no, I think Kyler with Marvin Harrison will like kind of show us where he should be on this list, because that's kind of the reason why he's not on my top 10 is like, I think he has the potential to be that, and he may show out and he may prove like, hey, I'm one of the better guys in the NFC, kind of like what I talked about with Jordan Love. So I could definitely see that. I think other guys that are looking in from this list, if we're talking about guys with great draft status, it's guys like Jared Goff, who was a former first overall pick, Baker Mayfield, who was a first overall pick. And then if you're looking at kind of late round guys or guys that developed a little bit later in their careers, I think it's like your Brock Purdy's, your Geno Smiths. That's really all I have on the list here. You already talked about Kyler and Hurts, and it's that weird range of like when we were talking about like quarterback 7 and 8, it's like almost from that point to about quarterback 15. Some of these guys that we're talking about, it could be interchangeable. It's going to be very dependent on their supporting cast staying healthy, them staying healthy, and then also how well everything gels together. If there's some of these newer systems or newer players getting infused into these offenses. So we'll see how that all plays out. We are actually underneath the hour mark. I thought we were going to go over and get on a few tangents, and we did. We got some good content out. But we're in the perfect take section. And my perfect take, I'm going to go back to my quarterback 9, Jordan Love, who I think will be, by the end of this year, a like cemented top 3 quarterback in the NFC. I don't think there's going to be a shadow of doubt. I think he's going to prove that he's one of the top guys in his conference. Now, a lot of the guys that we talked about on this list are AFC guys, and maybe in a year or two, he can put himself in those conversations. But I think for right now, that's the step he takes in 2024.
I like that. I do think because the NFC is a bit weaker, he has a strong chance to do that. But I think if he continues to ascend, you're right. We can talk about him with some of those like 6 through 8 tier kind of guys. But I'm starting to doubt my take now, which I've never done before, but I'm going to hold through because I think it could still work. It might change for our predictions episode the week before the season that we usually do. But my take right now is that Joe Burrow, out of all the quarterbacks in my top 10, will lead in passing touchdowns this season. I think T. Higgins does ultimately end up staying on the team. Jamar Chase, as we know, incredibly explosive. And then they added a guy like Jermaine Burton in the draft. They added 2 people last year, Charlie Jones and Andre Yoshivas in the draft, who I like both of those guys. And I think out of all the people that need to prove something this year on our list here, I think other than Lawrence, he's probably the guy. I think he's one of the guys that could be in contention for comeback player of the year, even though he played half this. It's a weird award. But I do think with the supporting cast that he has, he absolutely has the opportunity to lead the our list, at least, in passing touchdowns, because guys like Mahomes, Jackson, Allen above him, their receiving casts, not as good.
No, and you could argue that Joe Burrow's wide receiver trio could be the best by the end of this year. And the fact that he's got these 2 behemoth giants as his tackles in Orlando Brown and Trent Brown, and they just drafted Amarius Mims, who should be a phenomenal right tackle for years to come. I think there are very few excuses, barring injury, to why this offense shouldn't explode this year. So I think that's a great take. I can understand it changing, or you going with a quarterback that might have been outside the top 10 who's on a stellar
Yeah, it's true.
offense to kind of lead the league. So we'll touch more on that take at the end of the off season. But if you guys have any questions for us at Purrfect Takes, shoot them to us on Twitter. We'll be more than happy to answer any questions. And until then, we'll catch you guys next week when we talk about the top 10 skill position players in the NFL.